Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books author reading series. If you'd like to learn more about us and our many upcoming author events, please visit skylightbooks.com, where you can browse our inventory, buy books, and join our Friends with Benefits Club. You can also follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook. To speak to a real live bookseller like me, please call 323-660-1175. Thanks for your support, and enjoy.
I'm going to start, I think, right? Is that what we decided?
Okay.
Said, yeah. So this is going to be a little bit like Whiplash for you guys, since we're going to be going from a very strange, non-realistic story to very strange, realistic events. So maybe not that much of a Whiplash. Yeah. But I'm going to read a story that is called The Second Door. And kind of takes place in a strange place. People in it are vaguely pioneers, so maybe that's the connection to the West, but we'll see. It's called The Second Door. It's in 3 parts, so you'll hear me say 1, 2, and 3 at various points. The Second Door. After a while, we had by then lost track of not only the day, but of what month exactly it was. I realized that my sister had begun to speak in a language I could not understand. I cannot mark a moment when this change occurred. There must have been a period when she'd spoken it, or some melange of English in this new tongue, and I somehow didn't notice, responding instead to her gestures, to what I thought she must have been saying. But then some sound, a clatter of metal falling caught my attention, and I looked for the tin or the pan that had been dropped and realized the sound was proceeding from her mouth. Was it me, I wondered at first, some slippage in my brain, some malfunction of my hearing apparatus? I shook my head to awaken my mind, scraped the inside of each ear hole with my smallest fingers. Come again, I said. Her brow furrowed. She spoke again, that same clatter of metal, incomprehensible. It was not the sort of sound that was possible for a human throat to make, and yet her throat made it. But I am getting ahead of myself. I've lived alone now for long enough to no longer have a proper sense of how to convey a story to another being. Even before I lived alone, it was only my sister and me, and our relationship was, shall we say, peculiar. Even before she lost her ability to speak in the way humans do, she was odd, and we had lived together so long as to make the need to converse with one another nearly superfluous. We did speak occasionally, but gestured more often than moved our lips, and in general lived in the brusque and silent accord enjoyed, if enjoyed is the right word, by certain long-married couples. Or so my sister suggested to me. Besides us, I have not met any couples, long married or otherwise, so I cannot say with certainty. Not that we were living as if married. No, our relations were at all times innocent and chaste, as if we were merely those children's dolls that give every appearance of being human until you remove their clothing and see the smooth plane where genitalia would otherwise be. Still, we had been so long in one another's company that she knew nearly always what I was thinking. And I knew the same about her. We shared that odd intimacy that comes from living partly in one's own head and partly in another's. I loved my sister deeply, or as deeply as any sexless doll could. Perhaps I have exhausted that metaphor. I do not wish to suggest I am or ever have been anything other than human. I was born in the usual way, the issue of a mother and a father, so I have been told. I have no memory of my parents, though my sister always insisted that yes, we had a mother and a father. It is important to note this fact, though I cannot independently verify it. By the time my memories began, my parents were dead. My sister would sometimes recount their deaths to me late at night as she was trying to coax me to sleep, acting this out with the 2 posable dolls that we possessed. To comfort me, I suppose. An odd notion of comfort indeed, and yet hearing stories about their deaths allowed them to be alive again for me for just a moment, before they were once again consigned to death. She told the story each time in a different way so that I was never quite sure what the truth was. Indeed, I half suspected that one evening she would not recount their deaths at all, that she would confess that my parents were still alive and waiting for me somewhere, in a concealed room in the house, say, or through the door set in one side of the house that we never used. But whether she intended to tell me this or not, she did not do so before her speech changed, and she could tell me nothing at all. In many versions of the story, she told me, my parents were settlers, pioneers, the first in this place, and because of a failure of some kind, left alone, just the two of them. Sometimes she said we were in a remote area of a southern continent and my parents had been the only survivors of a boat that sunk. Sometimes it was a separate world entirely, and they had arrived through the air or by slipping underneath the usual order of things, or by passing through a mirror. Separate world, I mused. Separate from what? From where they came from, my sister said. And where was that? I asked, but she shook her head. For her, this was not part of the story. There they were, the two dolls that represented my parents, my sister's hands making them jump up and down slightly as she moved them across my blanket. She made my father speak in a voice that was lower than hers, my mother higher. They stopped, looked around. Do you suppose it's safe? Asked my mother in her high voice. Should we turn back? We can't turn back, my father said. We have no choice. And then they were screaming, simply moved by sleight of hand under my blanket, made to vanish, simply gone. Again, I said. Smiling, my sister obliged. Whatever the case, whatever had happened to my parents, it had something to do with our house, which was not, as my sister informed me, properly speaking, a house. Its windows were circular and made of thick glass and could not be opened without removing a series of screws and prying off a rubberized seal and a sturdy metal ring. There were 24 of these windows strung down a long cylindrical central hallway that constituted the majority of our dwelling. At one end, traveling gently down slope, was a hatch that led to my room. The room had the same circumference as the cylindrical hallway, but a depth of no more than 7 or 8 feet. At the other end of the hallway, upslope, was a hatch leading to the room that had become my sister's, a kind of tapered cone with glass walls that had been burnt of smoky and opaque black. In the middle of the central hallway, on each side, was a door, a window in its upper half. One side looked out on what seemed to be a flat and barren plain, as did all the windows in the hallway, not on a door. The other door's window opened onto a deep darkness, as if onto nothing at all. The first door, to the plain, could be used in time of need, my sister taught me. The second door, no, never. To open the second door would be to invite the end. What do you mean by the end? I asked. Again, she just shook her head. What's out there? I asked, peering through the window of the second door, through the only window that looked out into darkness. Is anything out there? Don't open that door, she said firmly. Promise me. Despite my promise, I tried once to open the second door. There was a procedure required for this to happen, a process inscribed on the door itself. First, the door had to be primed, and then a countdown would begin. Finally, I would have to throw a lever, and the door would spring open. I got as far as priming the door. I had not realized that this would also trigger a dimming of the lights and the peal of an alarm. The sound brought my sister running from her room, her face creased with panic. She quickly unprimed the door and scolded me. The whole time she was doing so, I was wondering if I had the strength of will to disable her and continue the process. Apparently, I did not. When my sister was alive, we kept mainly to ourselves, to our own quarters. My sister referred to them as quarters, and so I did as well. We would meet for meals in her quarters, feeding off the provisions that were stored behind the panels of the central hallway. Eventually, my sister never tired of informing me our provisions would run out. In preparation for this, she had begun to forage outside. Sometimes she would slip through the door, the first door, not the second, and come back with something to eat. She would be gone mere minutes sometimes, or other times hours. Often, when I was young especially, I would stand by the door and await her return. Sometimes I would go instead to the second door and consider pursuing the procedure to open it, but I worried that my sister, who after all knew my thoughts almost as well as I did, was waiting for this just outside the first door and would stop me if I tried. I often at these moments placed my hand on this second door. It was cold to the touch. It would have taken a mere flick of the wrist to activate the sequence, and yet I never did. When she returned, she was dragging a carcass of a sort of creature unlike anything she had taught me about. A tangle of legs, oozing clusters of eyes, limbs that continued to throb even in death, or simply gobbets of flesh, still weeping blood, cut from what creature I couldn't say. Out of breath, she would drag her latest find into her quarters and close the hatch. When she next opened it, there would be no sign it had ever been there. What's out there? The dolls that were my parents would sometimes say as they were propelled across my blanket by my sister's hand. Why does the view out the first door's window look so different from the view out the second? Why is there darkness beyond that one door? But they never had an answer. Shall we go through the first door? One would say to the other. Shall we go through the second? The other might respond. If the dolls went out the second door, they would die immediately. If they went out the first door, they might wander for a time before eventually dying. Either way, they die, I pointed out. Yes, said my sister, remember that. In the end, they always die. Why did the view from the door's window look so different from the other windows? I asked my sister this, expecting her, like the dolls of our parents, who she in fact spoke for, to have no answer. I was surprised when she gave the question serious consideration. It is as though we are in two different places at once, she finally said. One door opens onto one place and the other onto another. Then, I said, steadying myself on the wall beside me, what place does that make this? No place, she said. This is not a place at all. But if something is not a place, what is it? Can it be said to be anything? And what can be said of those living within it? 2. My sister had always been the one to instruct me. In the absence of my parents, she fed me, clothed me, reared me. Everything I know about what it means to be human, I know from things she said to me or from images, moving or still, she showed me on the still functioning screen in her quarters. Now that she's gone, the screen will not work for me. I wonder sometimes how much of what I think I know is embroidered falsely upon these images. Is my mind working with what was given to create another, fuller, more promising world? Can you understand me? I asked her. She nodded. Say yes, I said, a distressed screech proceeding unnaturally from her mouth, though she did not seem unsettled by it. Indeed, she seemed placid, calm. Do you not hear that? I asked. How you sound? A long hesitation, and then she shook her head. She opened her mouth, and it was suddenly as if I were inside a car as it crashed, metal buckling and crumpling all around me. I fled. Another attempt, an hour later, perhaps 2, once I had steeled myself again. There I was, knocking on her hatch until she opened it. Hello, I said. When she responded in a low whisper, it was as if a pot was being scoured by sand. I winced, and she immediately fell silent. I extended to her a writing pad, a pen. Perhaps this will work better, I said. She nodded and took them with a little bow. Furiously, she scribbled on the pad, filling first one page, then a second. When she finally, triumphantly, handed the pad back to me, however, it was covered in only senseless script, clotted and gnarled, gibberish. For a time, we simply avoided one another. I hoped from one day to the next that something would change, that I would simply awaken one morning and find everything to have reverted back to normal, to have us both speaking the same language again. Instead, with each day, the gap between us grew until after a week, a few weeks, once the plain outside the door glittered with frost, it was as though there had never been intimacy between the two of us at all. The meals we had shared before we now took separately, each in our own quarters. If I came out of my quarters to find her in the central hall, I would turn around and retreat, and if the situation were reversed, she would do the same. We might have gone on like this a very long time, until the day I discovered her body lying face down in the hall, or she discovered mine. Instead, something happened. My sister would still, despite everything, sometimes leave in search of food. She would go out the first door and be gone an hour, a day. She returned burdened by hunks of bluish flesh or hauling the gooey remains of a carapace. When I heard her leave the house, as soon as I was sure I was alone, I went out into the hallway and stood by the door, the second door, and pondered opening it. I would stand with my hand on the mechanism, staring out the window into the darkness, staring at nothing, until I heard the sound of the first door opening and my sister returning. Then I would rush back to my quarters. Until one day, staring into the darkness, staring at nothing, I realized that there was something there after all. How long I had been staring, I don't know. Long enough to feel as if I were no longer in my body, as if I were nowhere at all. And then something, a flicker or flash of movement in the glass, caught my attention and brought me back. It was, I thought at first, a reflection of my face, the ghost of my own image caught in the glass and cast back at me. As I moved my own face slightly, smiled, inclined my head, the ghostly image in the glass reacted precisely as expected. It was only when I settled again, stared out again, motionless, that I realized the flicker was still there. I held very still. It was there, deep in the darkness beyond the glass, drawn perhaps to this face, my own, it saw through the glass. I waited, I watched and waited. And yes, there it was, features nearly aligned with my own reflection. There was barely anything there, and yet there was something there. By the time my sister returned, I was back in my quarters, turning over what I had seen. A face, almost like my own, but not quite, nearly submerged in the murk. I had the dolls. My sister had abandoned them in my room and had not retrieved them after her voice transformed, and with these I played out what had happened. The doll that had been my father I designated to be me. He walked down the long cylindrical hall, and the trough formed between my legs by the dip of the blanket. Halfway down at the hall's knee, the doll stopped and looked out the thick circular window set in the door. Did he see anything? No, he did not. Or did he? He wasn't sure. He almost turned away, and then suddenly, there, pushing up against the blanket from beneath, the other doll, the one who had been my mother. What was it now? The doll that was me couldn't make out her features through the blanket, not clearly, though he knew that something was there, something roughly human in form. It was only a question of how to coax her out of the darkness. A number of days passed before my sister went outside again. I waited impatiently, hardly leaving my room, afraid to show too much interest in the second door while my sister was still inside. But then, at last, finally, she left. I rushed immediately to the second door, peering out into the darkness. I waited. Nothing was there. And then, though I could see little more than my own reflection, I felt something was. "Hello," I said. "Don't be afraid." Nothing changed or moved, not a thing. "Please," I said, "let me see you." But as I said it, I realized that I didn't need to see to know, that something, an idea, had already begun to coalesce in my mind. And just like that, I knew who it was. 3. When my sister, or rather the being that had taken the place of my sister, returned to the first door, it could not open it. I had locked it from the inside. It pounded on the door, crying out in that language that was not a language. Though I could not understand a word of what it said, or even be sure that what it said were words, I knew what it wanted, to get in. It had killed my sister and taken her shape, her manners, her gestures, her whole being. But something had slipped, and it could not take her speech. If I hadn't sensed my true sister, the dead one, floating in the darkness behind the glass, I would never have known. I let the creature pound. It would not get in, not again. It is still there, still pounding, its face crusted with frost. I see it in those brief moments when I tear myself away from the second door. It has been there for days now. I know what it wants. Its gestures are clear enough. "Open the door," they say, "open the door." And yes, I have come to believe that this is something I should do, open the door. Only not the door it desires me to open. In my bed, I play with the dolls. My father is no longer my father. He is me. My mother is no longer my mother. She is my sister, not the pretender, the real one. The male doll goes down the hall and stops to stare through the dark window set in the door. He sees something, or not sees exactly, senses. He's sure something is there, or rather someone. Impossible, since she is dead, but somehow still there nonetheless. He waits and watches, and then he initiates the procedure. He arms the door. The countdown begins, lights flash, an alarm sounds, and then, after a moment, he is free to throw the lever and open the door and join his real sister. There she is, billowing out of the darkness, her head torn off, coming toward him. I record this in a language that I, at least, can understand, having, as I do, no other. Whether anyone else will come who can understand remains to be seen, though not by me. I'm going to step out into the dark side of our house that is not a house. I'm going to rejoin my sister, the real one, the one who is dead. I will not be coming back. Or rather, when I do come back, as soon as I open my mouth to speak, you will know it is not me.
I love that story. So this book is a different kind of book. As was mentioned in the introductory comments, it's about an event, something that happened that some of you probably remember to varying degrees. The takeover of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in southeastern Oregon in 2016 by a group of anti-federal public land protesters led by the son of a Nevada rancher named Ammon Bundy, who was extending basically a struggle that had begun on his family's ranch in Clark County, Nevada, in rural Clark County, Nevada, which is the same county Las Vegas is in. But But anyway, Ammon Bundy, there we go, son of Clive and Bundy, basically summoned his internet friends to an escalation of a battle that his family had begun a couple years earlier, a very messianically inflected battle against the federal government for a restoration of their idea of the Constitution. And intermixed with this were a ton of different things, which I will not go into trying to explain right now. But for various reasons, I found myself drawn into this story, and it became the central focus of my life for a number of years. Instead of giving a long spoken explanation of everything that's going on, all the different characters, I'm going to try to move through just a few set scenes and then explain what needs to be explained maybe a little later or as it happens. Ammon Bundy is not from Oregon. He was drawn to a particular case involving another ranching family that resonated with his own family's history and made it a cause that he was able to attract a lot of people to, basically because of the internet. This is the story of a group of armed Facebook friends challenging the sovereignty of a rural county government and the federal government in a very remote corner of the Intermountain West, Harney County, Oregon, where the population is about 7,000 people. The county itself is the size of Massachusetts. There are about 5 cops in the sheriff's department, a few cops in town. And for various reasons, which we'll go into later, Ammon had become a very charismatic figure on the right who had the ability to summon people armed to join him in his divine struggle. I'm going to begin with just a little set piece from one of the more disturbing and clownish of them, a man named John Ritzheimer. After John came to town, he started posting a lot of videos to the internet, and this is actually one of the ones that, some of them are among the videos that people most know from this story. He's the guy who got mad when all the dildos were sent to them. He's the guy who made the video about, like, Daddy made an oath, and that's why he couldn't be with you on Christmas. But this is kind of my favorite video of John's, and it's at a very different tenor. There's another less-known video of Ritzheimer's from around this time that I actually enjoyed watching. The more I watched this one, the stranger it got. I found it had effects well beyond Ritzheimer's patriot intentions. Its lack of deathly oath magic was a plus. Nobody swears any oaths or promises to die. Also, John's outdoors in this one, and that seems to be a good thing for his mood. He's pulled his truck out into the desert and parked it under an especially craggy and regal-looking butte, its coating of snow only adding to its aloof, aristocratic air. Dressed in desert combat fatigues, John has an assault rifle slung across his back. He's not alone this time. Another camoed-out dude is standing in the snowy sagebrush holding up a big, colorful map of the United States. Yellow, pink, green, and blue. A third compatriot, Arizona militiaman Joe O'Shaughnessy, watches in the foreground, bemused, as Ritzheimer launches into his routine. Let's call it the Great American Unfuck, because that, unfucking, as he'll explain, is what he and the boys are here to do. First, though, he needs to locate himself and all of us on the earth and on the map. To unfuck, you've got to know where you stand. He's pointing at the sky, seeming to use the sun to orient himself in relation to the map, even as we see the sun is shining dimly behind him, smeared and grayed by a thin layer of cloud. We're here, he says. Yeah, we're here in Oregon, and the mission is to unfuck all of this. As he says this, his gloved hands sweep diagonally southeast across the continent. So I'm hoping the rest of the militiamen and everyone out there is ready, because, he concludes, we're going to initiate this mission. Next, pleased with himself, he just does it all over again. We're here in Oregon, he repeats, to the chuckles of his buddies, pointing to the sky again, and then again, the map, yep, he says, as if to confirming that they definitely aren't lost. We're here in Oregon, and we're going to unfuck all this. Again, his dark gloved hands move like cloud shadows across the map, gliding west to east across the continent, pulled by his elongation of all, until the spell is complete, punctuated by the sibilant precision of this. I say spell because whoever improvised and dumb whatever it is Ritzheimer and friends are doing, and it is both, this is some kind of rite, and all who watch are participants in its hokey witchery. Magic is always at least a little hokey, but the more I watch, the more it occurs to me that whatever is meant by unfucking has also got to be some seriously occult stuff. An undoing of the fucked. It certainly sounds elemental. Then there's this. In the movement Ritzheimer traces across the map, he's recapitulating in reverse the arc of manifest destiny, the path of Ammon's beautiful pattern, the old route of the Oregon Trail. What would unfucking this entail? Its disconception? I know he means something else, maybe the opposite, more like a reenactment, a restoration of Ammon's beautiful pattern, but it's not really what he's done. At this point, my cinema-colonized imagination takes over. All those would-be pioneers who died out there along the way, do they spring back to life in some other universe, reassemble out of the dust into coherent flesh, walking backward, zombied out to the east as John traces the great messianic reversal and rewinds America, erasing it? As I hit play again and again, another witchy thing is happening to me. It takes a while for me to notice, but with each viewing, the silent world around Ritzheimer and his friends gets more present. Soon my attention is riveted to the craggy rim of the basalt bench. That butte lurking above them begins to leak in from the background to take over the whole frame. By my fifth or sixth time through the clip, I'm not listening to Ritzheimer at all anymore. More than that, it's like I actually can't hear him or even see him. Fucked or unfucked, all I see is stone. So then a lot of stuff happens. A huge portion of the book and of the story. They occupy the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. Malheur means misfortune, bad luck in French, which nobody seems to have taken into consideration at the time. Why it's named that is another story itself. They occupy the refuge for a while. The leadership is taken out in an FBI operation when they're on the move trying to proselytize and spread the word. Most of the people flee. Eventually the occupation is brought to an end. One person dies, a man named Lavoy Finicum.
You can't tell them how it ends or they won't buy the book.
That's in the middle. That's like, and he just keeps dying. He does. And then everybody goes to court. And there's a whole other section of the book that's about the trials. A bunch of people pled guilty, but a bunch of people did not. And that's really where I caught up with a lot of the people who were involved in the occupation itself. A lot of the, my initial involvement during the occupation was with people from the Paiute tribe of Harney County, the Burns Paiute tribe, who were in opposition to this occupation, unsurprisingly, particularly when Ammon announced very early on he was returning the land to the rightful owners. They had a different story about that, and a very different ideas about relationships to land and different ideas about time that were that form a big part of this book and will come up in a little bit later. But in court, I met a lot of these people who had disappeared when the occupation evaporated, and also some of the people who attached themselves to their cause afterwards, who had nothing to do with the occupation, including this little excerpt begins very quickly with one of the most interesting people I met in this whole story, a man named John Lamb, an Amish, a recently no longer Amish man from Montana who is basically still religiously Amish, and he drives a car now, and is a pacifist, so a very strange figure in this, and doesn't use weapons, and a very strange figure in this movement. And on Yom Kippur in 2016, a day off during the trial, I had a long interview with John where I heard all about his life. And this begins at the ending of that interview and takes us through a little tableau in downtown Portland where a bunch of different people are assembled. And also we get a little hint towards the end of some of the other characters that will appear. This is a very intense time in Portland. The local Black Lives Matter group was involved in a lot of intense protests at the city hall, and on this day had taken over the city hall to protest a new police contract. So throughout this scene, there's police helicopters and police running around everywhere. And later, that group comes in, the leader of that group comes in as characters because the people from the occupiers from the Bundyite movement, or some of them, attempted to form and failed to form an alliance with Don't Shoot Portland is the name of that group for a number of reasons that are probably obvious, but weren't obvious to them at that time, but led to some interesting conversations. But those people, you get a little glimpse of some of the action that's happening involves also those protests are happening in the background of this scene. I was likely the only person downtown that afternoon contending with the contorted legacies of Jeffersonian rhapsody and hypocrisy. Everyone else was too busy being their own version of the boisterous sea to care. Oh, and this is all happening under the federal courthouse in downtown Portland, which, in a brilliant little piece of federal foresight. In marble over the courthouse, right where everybody has to protest in front of the courthouse, is a quote from Thomas Jefferson that says, "The boisterous sea of liberty is never without waves." The boisterous sea of liberty is never without waves. So I came to think of this little space as the boisterous sea. And this chapter goes into also the disturbing origin of that actual quote. But anyway, the boisterous sea. Everyone else was too busy busy being their own version of the boisterous sea to care. John Lamb was certainly busy. Our conversation was interrupted often by the roar of the helicopters, the rattle and tromp of body-armored cops, and more than anything, by the ringing of one of John's 2 phones. Patriot supporters needed logistical help, as did his own family, because Rebecca, who was his wife, was on her way from Montana, and she was bringing a bunch of their 11 kids. John had delivered most of them. Rebecca had delivered far more children herself. She was a midwife and had presided over the births of hundreds of her neighbors' children. This was to be Rebecca's first time driving a long distance, and would also be the first time she had driven in a city. She was a little nervous about it, no longer simple and plain. The family had bought an old public transport vehicle, a half-size city bus, the kind you see in rural communities or transporting residents from nursing homes. It was the only vehicle big enough to carry them all. Rebecca also liked taking it grocery shopping. She could use its wheelchair ramp to push her shopping cart right up inside. Our interview done, we walked together as the clouds and mist began to roll in to where a few of John's friends had been assembled all day. Their Patriots' Corner had been set up in the shadow of the towering county jail, which doubled as a federal holding facility. It was Yom Kippur, and so it seemed appropriate that periodically Brand would pick up the shofar and the horn blast would vibrate in the leaves of the ginkgos above the gathering downtown traffic. Brand Thornton is one of the Bundyites. He's a former Mormon turned Messianic Jew, he calls himself, and his practice is very focused on the shofar, which he brings everywhere. He blows the shofar for power and protection. And he's doing it here. Somewhere up there, Ammon and Ryan Bundy, who are in prison and are up in this tower, could hear, Brand assured me. Cops clomped by again, headed in the opposite direction. Distant voices raised a shout, and now I felt a tug at my sleeve. 2 elderly Chinese women who had been picking fallen ginkgo berries off the lawn in the park since morning now wanted to borrow my height advantage again. We'd been interacting in improvised sign language off and on since I'd arrived in the park earlier in the day. Now they needed me again to shake down more of the berries still stubbornly clinging to their branches. I tried to free as many as I could for them while the women laughed and, as far as I could tell, mock scolded me for my undeniably poor efforts. It had begun to drizzle a little. Visible through the leaves beneath the ashy clouds overhead, the police helicopters droned on. I was still in an expansive democratic mood, and this little scene only added to it. These women, their laughter, their public harvest of the fallen fruits of the polis, my awkward attempts at assistance. Brand blew another blast on the shofar. The women came closer, fascinated it seemed, pointing at it, talking between themselves. I was taking notes on the whole tableau when I felt another tug on my sleeve. The women had a question, it seemed, their faces bright with that sort of excitement. They were pointing at the shofar, which Brand had placed now on a bench. And if you're not familiar with the shofar, it's that ram's horn. So it's a very intense object. What was it, I guess they were asking? Yes, I said, not knowing what to say since they couldn't understand me at all. Shofar, I said, pronouncing the thing, nodding my head. It's a horn, I added, moronically. But I'd misunderstood, and now they explained, improvising some charades. They pointed at me, pointed at the shofar, mimed me picking it up, walking to the nearest ginkgo, and mimed me reaching up and whacking at those higher-up berries, the ones I'd failed to reach before. Now they were pointing at Brand. They wanted me to ask him. They were huddling at me now, beaming the question at me with bright eyes and open faces. So I did it. I went over, tapped Brand on the shoulder, pointed out the expectant pair, explained their request. No! Brand said, flabbergasted, furrowing his brow, his usually buoyant demeanor vanishing. It is not for that. He scolded me, and then the women, and then turned away. I shrugged at my new friends, trying and failing to contain my laughter at this American scene, their determination to get the last of those berries. Brand's offended petulance. It occurred to me that it was more than likely these women had no idea who any of us were, why we were here, why there were so many cops and helicopters about. They probably had no idea what was going on at all. Did they care? Would they have cared if they'd known? They were on another mission, a big and important one, judging by the girth of the sack of berries they'd collected. This also seemed marvelous to me, another layer of public life, a whole other world, right here in the midst of the noisy scrum of liberty. Belatedly, I began to wonder what they were going to make with all these berries. I made to ask, using my face, lips, and hands in the crude sign language we deployed earlier. I tried to mime tea-making, food-eating, grinding, mashing, chewing. They gazed back at me with what seemed a vague indifference, and then they too turned away. My Day of Atonement tour of downtown Portland still had one more stop. Matthew Dethridge, who was another one of the occupiers, had just arrived in the cluster of Bundyites at Patriots Corner, and now we took a stroll together around the parks of downtown. He walked very slowly. I wondered if he was in pain. He spoke again of his transformative experience of community on the refuge and how his own alienated experience of unneighborly American neighbors had impeded to his mind access to anything, like what he'd felt for the first time out in the occupation at Malheur. As Matthew and I perambulated, sometimes raising our voices to hear each other over the helicopter din, we passed the various monuments that adorn the walks under the trees in the two parks, Lonsdale and Chapman Squares, that are framed by the City Hall, jail, federal building, and federal courthouse. I'll skip the descriptions of some of these other monuments to get to the monument that is the key in this scene. Next, we came to a statue I somehow hadn't noticed before in all my time downtown. Seriously overwrought, even for a public monument. This one looked like a 3D model of a vintage movie poster, an image advertising a Western, something about heroic pioneers. As we passed it, absorbed in conversation, out of the corner of my eye, I caught some of the words of the inscription in the base. These too were from the sage of Monticello. Thomas Jefferson was everywhere today. The human figures that rose from the sculpture's Jeffersonian base were a trio of Caucasians, a family in bronze. The tallest, a bearded man, really looked an awful lot like Charlton Heston of the Ten Commandments. His left arm was around his pioneer bride, who was pressed lovingly to him as he gestured sweepingly, animatedly, upward with his right arm at some unseen, splendid promontory toward which her eyes followed. The couple's boy child looked rigid and serious, even with his mother's hands on his shoulder and in his hair. I knew these white folks were hardy pioneers because they were standing in front of a wagon wheel. There is no wagon in the sculpture, but the wheel does the trick. Leaning on that wheel is a single flintlock rifle. Completing the scene behind the trio and above the trees rose the concrete and steel of the Multnomah County Jail. God damn, I guffawed to myself, ain't that America? Armed, sentimental white people dreaming of the frontier while a big prison creeps up from behind. And good old Thomas Jefferson himself providing the inscription, this time in full presidential mode, from one of his addresses to those he was in the habit of calling my children, the native peoples of America. In this case, the text was from a presidential address to the Osage people of the country that later became the states of Kansas and Missouri. But you wouldn't know this from the monument. It is so long since our forefathers came from beyond the great water that we have lost the memory of it and seem to have grown out of this land as you have done, says faceless, undead Jefferson. We are all now of one family, born in the same land and bound to live as brothers. The Great Spirit has given you strength and has given us strength, not that we may hurt one another, but to do each other all the good in our power. If Ammon was being guided by the Holy Ghost, the story he'd set in motion was guiding me over and over to figures like this one, where something about American being seemed in a flash laid bare. Here Jefferson's sovereign pronouncement actually declared historical amnesia a national and racial condition. But that wasn't all. In doing so, it laid white claims to the American continent on that very condition of forgetfulness. These movie poster pioneers, these sovereign homesteaders, these original adverse possessors weren't rising, as the quotation suggested, out of the American soil. They sprung directly from Jefferson's words. Words that were, in turn, being whispered to no one. This land claim was addressed to phantoms. The Osage are completely erased from the production. There's no suggestion of their existence anywhere in the sculpture, and besides, their homeland was nearly 2,000 miles away. I was alone now. My conversation with Matthew finished, I'd left him back at the benches with Bran Thornton and John Lamb and the rest of Jefferson's living amnesiacs. Jason Patrick was also there now, as were Angie and Lisa Bundy and some people I didn't recognize. I stopped to look back at them all after I'd parted. They made quite a figure themselves. Bran blowing his shofar, the others clustered about him with their banners and flags. Seemingly totally unnoticed by them, the old women were also still there, gathering up the very last of the ginkgo berries of the park. The indifference appeared wholly mutual. Now I turned away from that living American tableau and returned to gaze on the promised land, because that's what the wagon wheel sculpture erected in 1993 was actually called. It really was hideous, a historically and morally stupid chunk of sentimental schlock. I shudder to imagine the hysteria that would ensue should anyone ever propose to take it down. Above me, the helicopters still moved in and out of the mist. There was a blast of sirens, and from somewhere to the west of me, I thought I could hear voices, shouted slogans, it seemed. mingling with the robotic amplified voice of the law. And then we'll end with a total solar eclipse. The total solar eclipse of 2017 happened to pass through that territory where all this happened. So I went up there. And this scene takes place at a camp out hosted by the Burns Paiute tribe, the tribe that had contested the occupation. And the first character you meet, Jarvis, was one of the members of the tribal council during the whole occupation drama. Jarvis told us about a lake up in the pines, beautiful, quiet, ringed in some old growth. He'd been going there to cool off after his days clearing the meadows, struggling with the high thistles that had overtaken the tribe's land in the John Day Valley. The Watatika were hosting a campout up here for the 2017 total solar eclipse, and I'd come up with Kay, my beloved, to partake of the phenomena. Jarvis was right about the lake. It was a lovely spot. Beautiful timber, as he said, his years working for the Forest Service showing through. But it wasn't quiet today, not at all. The mountains had been turned into what seemed like a massive commercial for Subaru, something we were very conscious of, driving one ourselves. Everywhere we looked, it seemed there was a Subaru posed for ad copy with a white outdoorsy family unit setting up camp nearby. Down in the valley meadows and up on the steep slopes, interspersed throughout the pines, orange, turquoise, yellow, and lime green tents sprouted in all directions. It's a little embarrassing to admit, but I had come to the eclipse in our Subaru looking for the end of this book. Intuition told me that I might find it here where the tale for me returned to its beginning. For me, the story of Malheur had begun long before the occupation with my interest in another Western tale, one that had begun with a total solar eclipse. This was the story of Wovoka, Paiute shaman and the most famous of the Native American prophets of the 19th century Intermountain West. It was January 1st, 1889, and the prophet-to-be was gravely ill. He was lying on the dirt floor of his wickiup as the whole world went dark in the daytime. It was in the middle of this darkness that he was given his vision, images of a returning, refreshed earth and the reunion of the living and the dead. From this vision, Wovoka crafted a faith and a rite, the 5-night dance in which participants entered into entranced dream communion with their departed. Keeping the dance, Wovoka said, would help bring on the coming world, when the dead would return permanently in the flesh along with all the animals that had vanished from the land with the coming of whites. Also returning would be the earth itself, made new. The earth was old. That was Wovoka's message. According to Porcupine, a Cheyenne pilgrim who traveled all the way to Nevada to meet the prophet himself, Wovoka had said, recalling his initial vision, "My father told me the earth was getting old and worn out and the people bad. This earth too old, grass too old, trees too old, our lives too old," is how one English-speaking Arapaho practitioner described it. Then all be new again. Wovoka had seen that the Creator would do away with heaven and make the earth large enough to contain us all. To other visitors, he dictated a letter. Jesus is now upon the earth. He appears like a cloud. The dead are all alive again. I do not know when they will be here. Wovoka's vision borrowed from earlier visions like those of Smohala, the prophet of the Dreamer sect, who'd also foretold the return of a redeemed earth, while warning the faithful against holding property or working for money like white men. Wovoka's teachings didn't bother with such prohibitions. It was too late. White dominion over the West was now complete. Going by the name Jack Wilson, Wovoka himself was a ranch hand. Instead, his vision erased that white world in compelling collective fantasy. As the dance developed and spread, becoming a pan-tribal religion, it created new threads of communication and solidarity between far-flung native groups. Some adherents said that this movement of the new earth would slide from west to east, displacing Europeans back in the direction from which they had come. Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other groups described how the new earth would slide over the old like the right hand over the left. As the new earth arrived, dancers would be lifted upward and deposited onto the new land with the help of the sacred feathers they wore in their hair. Then they would fall into a trance for 4 days and awaken on the new earth alongside their old relatives and all the buffalo and everything that had been lost. The path of the returning redeemed earth in ghost dance theology happened to coincide with the path of totality, the transcontinental route of the solar eclipse that had come back to Oregon to see. The occluded sun's route would also follow quite precisely the line that John Ritzheimer had traced on the map of the United States in his great Unfuck video back in the preamble days of the occupation. The event would start in Oregon and sweep east across the state into Idaho, then farther south and east through Wyoming, Nebraska, Missouri, and Kentucky, passing finally through Tennessee and South Carolina, before heading out into the Atlantic. All across the country along this narrow band, the moon would slide across the sun, casting the shadow of totality from horizon to horizon, before moving on as the spinning earth also moved on. And I'll skip ahead just to the event. It started slowly. The moon biting into the sun, we watched it through our eclipse glasses. The sun and the dark nibble of the moon in the corner growing and growing. From time to time, we'd take off our glasses and look around at the rest of the world. It was there that the uncanniness really started. After a while, the light becomes a light you've never seen before. It gets coppery, but it's not like any other coppery light you've seen. It makes you want to look at everything. It makes you an earthling hungry for the sights of Earth. At least that's what it did to me. I went off wandering. I wanted to move around and look at everything at once, the leaves, the bark, the grass, the buttes, my hands. Everything looked exactly like what it was, and yet at the same time, somehow totally changed. I wandered over to the other long meadow on the tribe's property. This meadow was almost empty. Way at the far end of the valley, a couple of RVs were parked in the grass under the cottonwoods. In the middle of the valley was a lone human figure, standing beside a flatbed truck, looking up at the sun through his eclipse glasses. On the truck's bed was a whole sound system, and it was blasting music. Mournful chanting and drumming, tribal music, fluid drumming and song. It flowed over the whole scene. The valley was a bowl, really, a dish of golden grass under a huge golden butte. Chunks of craggled basalt thrust through the earth here and there. A line of junipers marched along the crest of the ridge. I was staring up at them when I noticed that the guy with the truck was calling to me. "Hey, bro," he said, "you got time to BS?" And so before I had time to think about it, suddenly there I was in the middle of a total solar eclipse talking about Wovoka and the ends and rebirths of worlds. My interlocutor had a blue bandana wrapped around his closely shorn head, a sleeveless white shirt bearing long muscled arms, and a cheerful, inquisitive face, the kind that searches you out in conversation, requiring that you be totally present. This guy really wanted to talk. "What did I think about all this?" he asked, gesturing with his long arms at the sky and also at the earth gripped in the spell of eclipse light. He knew the native perspectives, how some say you shouldn't look on such a thing. Some folks here had already headed into the tribe's huge teepee over in the other meadow, he told me. They would not emerge till it was over. But what he wanted to know was what the eclipse meant culturally to me, the white guy suddenly on the scene. I didn't know what to say except that it freaked me out in a way I liked. I guessed what I was feeling was a kind of delight. And then he was asking me if I'd heard of a guy called Wovoka. Well, yes, I said. In fact, I had. We talked about the prophet's eclipse vision of renewal, and then I told him about my book, and soon we were talking about Watatika history and then the occupation. He had some stories for me, he said. I realized then that I knew who he was. I'd been trying to talk to this man for months, actually for years at this point, and then had given up. He was Leland Dick. He'd been one of the instigators of the watch post vigil that Jarvis and friends had kept over the reservation during the occupation. "Go up there and turn on the lights for the people," he said his mother had told him. When talking with folks in the tribe about the occupation, Leland had mostly been a curious absence. More precisely, it had been his name that was missing. The stories of Leland were many, but the tellers guarded generally wouldn't say his name aloud to me. In the tales, he was just a guy from the tribe, someone who was upset about the occupation and the militia in town. He was a young man or a friend or a cousin whom folks were concerned about. They'd been worried about what he might do. He'd especially raised people's fears of open conflict when he'd gotten in a brief standoff of his own with a clump of militiamen in a local McDonald's. And now Leland was telling me his story of that day. I whistled, like you whistle at a deer. And all these armed militia guys, there were 12 of them, their heads just snapped around and they looked at me. And I took their pictures with my phone and they all got up. There were like 12 of them and they surrounded me. He hadn't been afraid, Leland said. Instead, he challenged them about their firearms. "Why you all got guns? What are you all afraid of?" And they say, "This is America." And I say, "Sure, I've been places where you got to carry just to go to the store for a Pepsi." I'd heard that one of them had said he was ready to die. "Okay," I said, "let's go. Me too. I'm ready. I'm Paiute." No one in the county had really confronted the militia guys like this, much less anyone as ready for action as Leland, and certainly not anyone as animated as Leland was by the history of this place. It had all been Paiute land, Leland reiterated, and they'd never given it up. Their treaty hadn't been ratified. The wars with us were some of the only wars the U.S. Army qualified as a war. I could see how Leland had made people worry. But in the end, the showdown had been averted. An older tribal member had guided him out of it. On the way home, the cops had pulled over the car he was in. He wasn't the driver, and when they'd asked him for his ID, Leland had refused to give it or his name. "You've got a Paiute ghost warrior here," was all he told them. And that had gone out over all the police radios. Above us, the moon kept on eating the sun. Kay joined us now, and Leland told us more about himself. He'd traveled the world, played basketball professionally in China. Having been all over, he hadn't been afraid of those militia guys. He'd been at Standing Rock, too, been there for weeks during that fall following the occupation, and gotten in some very hairy situations. It was important to know when it was time to back down, he said, something else he'd learned growing up. The native protesters were unarmed as always, except for our war drums, he qualified, laughing. Going out without war drums is like going to a gunfight without your guns. There's some things worth dying for, he added, like the land. We can't sell this land here. He gestured at the meadow and the creek behind it. This water is just going to get more valuable. At the same time, he wondered about how long our current systems of value would hold out. Do you think the money system will collapse soon, he asked. Me, I don't care. I'm Paiute. I'm ready. I can go up and hunt my elk, chill up in the mountains with the bros. I never cared about money. I've never believed it. You want me to go somewhere and fight for your oil? I do not think so. Somehow the way Leland talked, none of this had been anything like a rant. He was just enjoying himself, beaming the whole time, gesturing broadly and laughing brightly as the world grew dark. It was all really bending toward totality now. I went to a wander around with Kay and stare at it some more. Leland stayed at the truck with the drum music still flowing from the speakers, coating everything with sound and meaning, singing the event forward. I thought the light was nuts before, but this was officially insane. We staggered about in the bronze-blue world under the darkening hills. Every leaf, every rock was at once the same and somehow absolutely altered. The hillsides and the butte rims were like shapes in a haunted painting, a landscape at dusk, but dusk in another world, a new country on a planet that was still somehow ours. And then it was time. We were looking up through our glasses, Kay and I. There was just a sliver of sun left, and then there was nothing. It was all black. I took my glasses off. The sun was totally covered by the moon, ringed in the pale, cold light of the corona. The temperature had dropped, it seemed, instantly, something like 30 degrees. It had been a hot, dry summer morning when this started. Now cold enveloped us, as if it were rising from the earth. I could hear one bird, only one. The rest had gone silent. It was like night now, like a moonlit night, only duller, a dark glow on the land. I don't know if those 2 minutes were long or if they were short. It was like a kiss, is what I thought. I was an eager earthling in the weird dark, and then it passed, and the moon began sliding off. The weird copper light came back, gradually yellowing toward the sun of midday. We wandered back over to Leland at his truck. What did you think? I asked. It was my turn now. Imagine if you didn't know that was coming, he said. He heard the people used to go nuts in the old days and that they'd start shooting arrows in the crazy midday dark. Some things, he said, you aren't supposed to see. I was wondering if this was something I was supposed to see. We talked more about Wovoka's vision. Leland thought the path of totality could be the path of a new beginning. Natives say that the eclipse brings destruction, but now maybe this brings healing, a reversal. So much has been happening, he said. It makes you wonder, all these statues coming down. Out in the meadow, the heat of the day was beginning to touch us again. It makes you glad for the sun, Leland said, that it came back. You never know. I'm just glad it came back. We all bowed together, laughing to our star. The path of totality slid on away from us, the moon continuously gliding in front of the sun farther and farther southeast, across the whole continent, the whole country, yes. It was a sea to shining sea American event, well beyond the Subaru National Forest. All across the nation, people in this narrow band were experiencing earthlinghood made wholly briefly strange. They were even experiencing it together. Totality passed nowhere near D.C., but still a good portion of the sun was occluded there. Something of the event could be viewed, so the president, making an unusual effort toward national unity, stepped onto a balcony with his scowling bride and their bewildered-looking little boy. Was anyone surprised when he did what we'd all been reminding our loved ones not to do? He looked up and stared straight into the sun. Thanks for listening.
I think we're going to ask each other just one or two questions, then open it up, if that makes sense. And maybe I'll start. One thing I really love about your book is the degree to which you're able to see how many different kinds of people end up coming to the occupation. I mean, it's easy to see it as kind of just a unified group of everyone who's alike, but I think there's a very Western thing of a bunch of people getting together to do something for very different reasons.
And a lot of that too is, I think, was the fact that this was like a Facebook friend
Yeah.
too, And
But there's environmentalists, there's kind of fundamentalist Mormons, there's people who are just downright crazy, so on and so forth.
yeah, and I think part of that too. I think what can be surprising for people who are familiar with that milieu on the right is that, like, how not homogenous it is. Like, the people who came together with the Bundy cause were everything from anti-police militarization, libertarians, a lot of libertarians, total militia people, like border militia types, from that earlier militia spasm, ranchers, right, anti-public land activists, and all sorts of other folks.
And of course, the Bundys and a lot of the people who are coming from Mormonism, they see it as a religious event. They see it as a way of they're doing God's will as well.
I think that's the thing that the strange cohesion that Ammon particularly, and I didn't go into Ammon in this particular reading, but he's a very charismatic, magnetic individual, and he's really good at, and he's a trained missionary. Right? He did his mission. He's a very serious, very devout Latter-day Saint. He doesn't see himself as being on the fringe of the church at all.
No,
the church,
but there were a lot of fringe people there as well. Yeah.
But one thing that was really striking about the occupation and the milieu of the occupation is that it was leaderless, and they were always talking about how it was leaderless. Everybody was free to come and go. Nobody was in charge, though clearly it was Ammon's cause and the cause of a few of his friends. But the sort of energy that Ammon gave to it was very religious and very messianic. Right? That you are here, it was the people who came were there not just to return or give federal public land to the control of the states, which would be like the basic secular, their main cause. That's their argument, that federal public land is illegal according to their interpretation of the Constitution, and that all public land should be controlled by states and localities. But that Ammon gave this, and the Constitution itself, this intense theological purpose, right? That the Constitution itself is divinely inspired, that the Constitution itself is also a part of what is happening in the latter days, right? That the culmination of human experience itself is happening in the United States through the Constitution. This has been derailed, and it's up to whoever would come with Ammon now to restore the true path of the Constitution, to also restore the path of humanity. And he was offering this to a lot of people, and to a lot of people who were coming from pretty alienated, ragtag lives. And people came from all sorts of places to be bound in this mission without necessarily being converted to the religious components of it. But the flavor of it was super religious, and the fact that circulated through the internet seemed a huge part of why it worked. Like, because the internet is an amplifier and automator of human feeling and community, and the fact that was happening with this added messianic element that brought them into a space of, these are the final days, which they then reiterated by occupying a refuge with guns, which created a standoff situation, which meant that they were living in this community of intense feeling where they could feel that every day might be the last. Because within that community, they were while they were enjoying, though they seemed to be enjoying themselves, they were all also talking about how, like, tomorrow the feds are coming and it's going to be just like Waco, they're going to kill all of us, right? And that was a huge part of that community that they were then broadcasting live on Facebook every day during the whole time of the occupation.
You touched on it just a little bit in the reading you did, but one thing that's really fascinating to me is the way in which they had convinced themselves that they were going to speak for the Native Americans and return. They had all these ideas, and then were really kind of stunned when they discovered that the Native Americans living in the area did not agree with them.
There's particularly one of the people, and he is the person who died, Lavoy Finicum, a rancher from the Arizona Strip, the kind of most isolated.
Who also wrote an apocalyptic novel.
Who also wrote an apocalyptic cowboy western. That's a pretty amazing book, actually, except for its long didactic passages about property rights.
Every apocalyptic novel has that in it.
I don't know. There's a lot of John Locke and property rights in the middle of a world where all no technology works anymore because the Russians have somehow dropped an atmospheric nuclear blast that disables all electronics, and there's a battle for the end of time, basically, between a secret deep state conspiracy.
I'm sure Skylight has this book if you want to pick it
I don't
up.
know if they have it. But Lavoie's a really interesting character, and he had grown up. He had grown up on the Navajo reservation, and he had done his Mormon mission on the Lakota reservation in the Dakotas. So he felt he had a particular bond with Native peoples. And when the tribe came out against the occupation because they didn't believe Ammon was going to give the land back to the rightful owners, meaning them, among other things, and took advantage very shrewdly of the huge media presence in the county at that point to tell the story of that tribe, which nobody knows and had known anything about. Lavoie particularly took it upon himself to try to attract the tribe to their cause, believing that that they had a common enemy in the federal government, which did not play out the way Lavoie hoped. And he was the one person killed in the arrest of the leadership of the occupation. But he spent a lot of the last days of his life making videos trying to appeal directly to the tribe to join them in this struggle to throw off the federal government and the kind of rhetoric that he used. And that didn't work. But there's a whole history too of there's a melancholy cowboy thing that happens in the West of we displaced them and now our time has come, and therefore this troubling identification that happens.
Right.
But it also connects to there's a Russell Means who led the Wounded Knee occupation in 1973 in the Dakotas. Was a hardcore libertarian, ran for vice president, and before he died, made this long video for InfoWars about how everyone in America is now living on the reservation, and now how all you people know what it's like to live on the reservation because you haven't kept to your sacred document, the Constitution. So there is all this intertwining, and I think they understood that alliance was somehow possible, which it was not.
Right.
Yes.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about how that story happened, and where the pioneer element, and where it became clear that somehow they were abandoned children of some kind of settler family.
Yeah, that pretty early on, I had this notion of this, this boy and girl who just had ended up in this kind of space that they didn't completely understand, and that they were kind of abandoned. And then as it kind of went on, it evolved in various ways. I mean, I'm interested in, notions of spaceless space and things like that. So I was reading a fair amount of science fiction at the time and thinking about all these things that people think about as a way to move from one space to another without actually leaving the space that you're initially in, which would be great, but doesn't seem to work all that well. And so that was part of it too. Just thinking about they're in this space they don't understand. He in particular doesn't understand it because he wasn't old enough when his parents disappeared to really know what's going on. And deeply paranoid, but also has his sense of life is completely from his sister, and also from little bits and pieces of media that they have in whatever the space is they're in. And so I don't know where it came from exactly. I came with the title was the first thing I had with it.
Just the title.
So and then kind of went from there.
Did the title of the second door come before you knew what the second door was?
Yeah, it did actually. So then I had to figure out what the second door was. But yeah, I mean, I suppose I could have just been started writing it and thought, oh, yeah, I got to change the title. But instead, I had some notion that I had this sense of kind of different spaces. I've been reading a lot. There's a science fiction writer I'm really interested in called Gene Wolfe, who does a lot of work where he depicts things that seem like they're kind of strange historical past things that end up seeming, when you start to kind of go through them, you realize that no, this is actually kind of far future in a very strange way. So there's an elaborate description in one of his books of that famous picture of the Apollo moon landing. But it's described so abstractly that you read through the whole thing, and then he doesn't have the terms for astronaut and things like that. Then suddenly you figure out, oh, this is actually what it is, and it's just has become this artifact in the way that certain things from other civilizations that we come across are artifacts for us. So,
and in this book, and it's certainly not the first time that this kind of themes appear in the book, but it seems like there's a particularly strong amount of I don't know how to describe this, the horror of plurality. in terms of like people turning into other people or skins being shed and shapes, a lot of shape shifting.
Yeah, it's a creepy book. Yeah, There's a lot of stories in this about people who are very uncomfortable in their skin in various ways, or people who encounter people whose skin doesn't fit exactly, and there is a lot of kind of duplication and replication. She kind of duplication in this story, but it is. I think a lot of the story is. In this book in particular, seem to be about the relationship of selves to bodies and how that does or doesn't work. So, yeah. Let me ask you one more question, and then we're going to open it up to everybody, and just for a few minutes, and then if you guys want to sign books, we're happy to do that. I just wanted to ask, I mean, you before you published this, you'd published a lot of books of poetry. You had not published a book of prose till this. This book is probably twice as long as all your books of poetry combined.
I'd say probably considerably longer.
Okay. How was that transition for you?
Difficult.
Okay.
Both, I mean, it was difficult in terms of how much the different kind of work it is. It was an incredible workload. I mean, and some things about it were surprisingly easy too. I got obsessed, obviously, and I couldn't stop. And so that.
So it's partly you felt called to this particular. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then also, like, one thing I did enjoy about writing prose is that there was just so much to do. There was always something to do. So I was working all day and into the night most days, where with poetry there is a lot more. And it is something I also enjoy about poetry, when poetry is pleasing to write, which it is sometimes, and which sometimes it is not, that there's a lot of waiting. And then things happen, and then you look at it and play around with it, or at least, I mean, a lot of people write poetry in different ways, but in the way that I write it, this is so different, and it felt exciting to be entering into the landscapes and the places and the histories that mattered deeply to me, by being able to write my way into them, like sit down every day and just do that. But it was hard, and I think I told somebody this story earlier today before we started. The amount of work was very intense, and I remember once I was interviewing a rancher who was opposed to the Bundys in Harney County about it, and I called him up, and he was very surprised. He was the only person who did that. I interviewed so many people, and very few people took the time to like figure out who I was, really. Like, people are so eager. I mean, nobody listens to people, so people are pretty eager to tell their story. So, like, I'm writing a book about this. Great. Here's what I got to say. But this one guy, Jack Southworth, basically interviewed me for 15 minutes to find out who he was, and he was very curious. He's like, "You're a poet, you teach at an art school, you do this, you do that." And he kept asking questions, and then after about 15 minutes, he said, "Well, Anthony, with this book, you're going to have to learn how to work." And it was definitely, like, I realized, like, you had that waiting before, maybe from the beginning.
As soon as you heard the word poet.
It's like, and it was both like, you guys got a lot of patience, you're a cowboy, and you work really hard, I get it. But he was right, too. I mean, it was a different kind of work. I think the poetry is a kind of work also.
No, I agree. I wasn't maligning poetry in any way, but it is interesting to me to see people making those transitions in whatever direction they make them. So, do you guys have any questions? Is there anything you'd like to ask? Yeah. I think we've seen a few since then. White males.
Yeah, it turned out there's going to be some more. Yeah. And I think that's a big part of the crisis of the story. If you're familiar with what's going on in the West right now, there are a very small group of billionaires who are buying up everything that's available. And what's tragic about what Ammon was trying to do is, like, he's from a ranching family that had been used to being able to use public land when the priority of public desert land was for ranching. And those priorities changed.
Which is really common in the West. It's
really
like
common.
I grew up around people who did this all the time. Yeah.
And those priorities changed. Environmental priorities came in. Also, urban city, the Bundy family in particular, they unfortunately happen to live near Las Vegas. And Las Vegas basically made what was like a cap and trade deal to allow itself to continue expanding and killing desert tortoises and desert tortoise habitat by designating another portion of the county desert protection zone. It happened to be the grazing areas of the Bundys, and basically all the other ranchers out there gave up. This is in the 90s, and the Bundys instead, being super theologically oriented, discovered that God had ordained through the Constitution that the federal government couldn't own land. But the reality of if they are ever successful in convincing, in bringing about a situation where the lands of the federal lands are sold off to the states, a lot of the states are going to sell them off to these highest bidders, because a lot of the states have they're required to balance their budgets, and as soon as that happens, then those ranchers are done. There's no way they're going to be able to afford that land. So it's actually like there was something suicidal about the occupation, and there's something suicidal about what the Bundys are advocating for in the middle of this crisis about obviously the concentration of wealth and the other in very few hands. The other thing that I noticed was really strange during the occupation, or when meeting all the people involved in the occupation, when they talked about what they loved about being in this occupation, which at the front gate, when the news cameras came, every day they came. They had a news conference every day at 11, and they had like CNN and everybody there, and all their talk was all like, sometimes they sounded like Paul Ryan, right? It was all libertarian, either far libertarian or just Republican libertarian stuff. But I talked to people who were involved in it, and their whole thing is like, this was the best experience of my life because I got to live without money. I got to live in a community where nobody was in charge. They just sounded like anarchists, and basically when I talked to them, a lot of them are really Christian, and they would talk about, the ones who were sharper, let's say, would want to talk to me about, they were happy to talk to me about anything, and they would bring up, they're like, well, Bernie Sanders says he wants socialism, and that's great, except you can't have socialism if everybody doesn't agree. But their basic point is like every single person has to agree to socialism, and then it would be great. But it was interesting to have these people who are associated with like a deeply anti-socialist milieu talking about their yearning for socialism, but why it can't happen and why it's morally wrong. And then that goes into, there's theological reasons for that because of agency, and like if everybody's not acting through their own.
And then there's the weird relationship of Mormonism to the United Order and the attempt of that, which is a kind of socialist, which they still believe just failed because we weren't ready for it. And I mean, there's, yeah.
Yep. And the town of Bunkerville, where the Bundys are from, Cliven Bundy, Ammon's father's great-grandfather, led a basically Mormon socialist experiment to found that town. That town was originally, all the property was held in common and consecrated to God, and then it failed and was split up into individual property. So actually, during the whole battle over the Bundys' grazing rights, when Cliven was claiming that he had basically property rights not to the land but to the water and the grass, he was tracing that back to 1877 when the town was founded. That claim was entirely based actually on the claim of a socialist Mormon community, though Cliven would never call them socialist. He'd just call them his great-grandparents. So another irony in that, and another doubling back.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget, you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.